This is another really good talk that we have on one of the really hard problems. The last introduction that I
promises you can keep.
that making elections be trustworthy and secure is an extraordinarily hard problem, nigh unto impossible. And Matt has been working on this for a long time, and there's nobody better to tell us all about what needs to be done than him. So let me please give this to Matt Blaze.
So, thanks a lot, John. So I'm going to talk about some stuff I've been working on for about a quarter of a century now in one way or another. And when I started working in this area, I thought it was pretty hopeless. It was an incredibly hard problem with about 200 different dimensions to it. And everybody in different parts of the problem space didn't care to listen to anybody else working in the problem space. No one was working together. Everybody hated each other. And the problems were and still are, at least some level, fundamentally intractable. So I really didn't think this was an area that we would make progress in. But in fact, it's one in which we've made enormous progress over the last decade and a half or so, in ways that I think nobody anticipated when technologists started giving this serious thought. So how many of you are familiar with the US system of figuring out who our leaders are? Yeah. Okay. So we have some sort of democracy, and it's highly decentralized and hierarchical, but also highly decentralized. There are elections. We think about presidential elections, but in fact, elections in almost every jurisdiction in the United States are run by either counties or townships. So this is a local government function, generally governed almost entirely by state law and administered by a state official, improbably called in most states the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State's job in every state is this random job that no one thinks about until it becomes very important. The Secretary of State in most states is responsible for registering corporations that do business in the state and running elections. I'm not sure what those two things have to do with each other, but in most states, that's what that job looks like. And they basically administer the state election law. They're responsible ultimately for certifying the results of elections, approving local election procedures, and so on. But almost all of the operations, and for that matter, the budget for running elections, is run by counties, and so is competing with things like pothole repair and fire departments and other local government functions that we don't see just once a year on election day. And this is true for federal offices, state offices, and local offices. So all of the voting you do is run by your local county officials, usually with a vast army of either volunteers or very temporary workers hired for election day or a day or two before and after. And then everything goes back to normal after the election. So this is a logistical, either a nightmare or miracle, depending on your perspective. And you might have noticed over the recent past, over the last 8 or 4 years, or 20 years, depending on when you think this all started, there has been widespread mistrust from various political parties about the integrity of elections in the United States, about the the equipment that's used, about the processes that are being used, and so on. And this has been an equal opportunity mistrust. It's manifested itself in different ways in different elections, and you can argue about what has been better or what has been worse, but all political factions in the United States have had people who have expressed profound mistrust of election results over the last 20 years, throughout the 21st century, and for that matter, before that. So I want to talk about that a little bit. First of all, you cannot have an honest conversation about this subject, about election integrity in the United States, without acknowledging two simultaneous realities that are taken together incredibly frustrating and unsatisfying. Okay, the first of these unsatisfying realities is that there truly are serious technical flaws, vulnerabilities in much of US election infrastructure that could, if they were exploited, be used to alter the outcome of an election, potentially under some circumstances, in at least some US jurisdictions. And there's no running away from that. That's clearly true. But that's not the entire story. The second part of the story, the second frustratingly unavoidable reality, is that there's actually been no credible evidence ever, and by the way, when I say no credible evidence, I actually mean none, that technical vulnerabilities have ever actually been exploited to alter the outcome of a US election. There's been election fraud in the United States over the history of the country, but technical hacks to alter an election outcome are something that we've been looking for pretty closely. And if you find evidence of that, you'd become very, very important. And nobody has really demonstrated it. There's uncertainty because of the first problem, but there has never actually been proof that this has actually happened. So we have this sort of weird middle space here where we have the potential for problems and no evidence that those problems have actually resulted in incorrect or fraudulent elections. Now, that seems very similar to how we were thinking about the internet in the 1990s, right? We all knew that there were horrible vulnerabilities in pretty much everything, that the whole thing was made out of, paper mache. And we were warning for a while, one day this is going to be a problem. And, as it turns out, we were wrong. And, internet security turns out not to have actually been a big deal. So someday it feels like there's a bit of a ticking time bomb, and at some point our luck is going to run out, but there's no evidence that it has in fact run out. And this is true regardless of how satisfied or dissatisfied you are with the outcome of some election. And in fact, which of the two realities you focus on tends to depend on how happy you are with whatever election that we were talking about. So how did we get into this mess? How did we get into this mess where we know there are technical vulnerabilities in these systems? We don't know if they've been exploited, but boy, are we in trouble. So I'm going to show a picture, and this is a picture that when I show it to my students, I immediately feel old because they're all just staring blankly. But I think in this crowd, maybe I'll feel a little less old. You can feel old with me. Anybody recognize this? Okay. Yeah, this is not the reaction I get with my undergraduates. So what is this from? What state was this photo taken in? Florida. Okay. So this was from the recount of the 2000 election in Florida. And this fellow, who was the most photogenic person in the room, had the misfortune of striking just this amazingly good pose with his eyes wide open, looking at this card. This was a punch card ballot. and he was one of the recounters. This fellow worked for the Republican side. There was also a Democrat there. But all of them were looking at these cards, trying to make some sense of what they were doing. And this photo was in every newspaper, in every news show and the evening news for about a month. And the caption, to paraphrase, in late 2000, under this photo, was this, some version of, "Look at those idiots in Florida. This is terrible." And this is a national embarrassment. So this poor guy who's trying to actually figure out who won the election became the face of everything wrong with elections in the United States. This is grossly unfair because, in fact, the meaning of this photo has changed by about 180 degrees since then. And we now look back on this photo with great nostalgia. We look at this photo and we say, look at the strength of the system that they had in Florida. Even those idiots in Florida managed to have a system in which a person can look with their eyes wide open or squint, depending on what their vision is like, and figure out something about what the voter intended to do by looking at a physical artifact that the voter created. And that turns out to be a profoundly important thing that got lost after the 2000 election. So some quick history on this. The type of voting system that was in use in Florida and a few other states, including Wisconsin, but it really came up in Florida, was this machine, which was dates from the early 1960s. The technology was first used in the 1950s for elections, and it, in fact, is basically just Hollerith punch cards from the 1920s. The machine is wonderfully called a vote-o-matic, and it is a voting machine, but it doesn't use any electricity. The only electricity is the light bulb in the voting booth so that you can see what you're doing. Essentially, you put a card, which is a cardstock card that has positions that are perforated with little rectangles. And the way you cast your ballot is you put the card in the machine, and there's an arrow pointing to different holes in a plastic template that sits over the card fixed in the machine. And you take a little stylus and you punch out the little rectangle that sits beneath the hole corresponding to the candidate you want to vote for. And then at the end of the day, those ballots, you take it out, you put that card in the ballot box, and at the end of the day, those cards are put into a card reader, which could be hooked up to a computer, but in fact there are non-Turing equivalent tabulating devices that are used for this. And they figure out what the tally is based on reading where the holes are in the card. And the reader technology is pretty simple. It's optical. There's a little light source and a photodiode at each position. And if light makes it through, that means the hole has been punched out. And if it doesn't, that means it hasn't been. So it's a pretty straightforward technology. There isn't a lot of software involved except in reporting the results afterward, but the actual sensing of this is a pretty straightforward electromechanical process. The cards look like this. It's an example of a ballot. And you can see that hole number 68 has been punched out in this. Now you'll notice hole number 68 is not the name of the candidate. When you take this card out of the machine, you just see that there's a hole at some position, but you don't know really, unless you've paid a lot of attention, whether that is the hole corresponding to who you intended to vote for. At that point, your interaction with the card is supposed to be just limited to putting it in the ballot box as a voter. But this turned out, this system, which had been in use for about 40 years at the time of the 2000 election, had a flaw that only manifests itself in incredibly popular elections. And the 2000 election was in Florida, in certain counties, wildly, hotly contested. More people showed up to vote than ever before. And what turns out to happen is there are little cardboard rectangles that you're punching out. You may be familiar with physics. Those cardboard rectangles go somewhere after you punch them out. They don't actually just disintegrate and disappear from the universe. Where do they go? Well, where they go is right behind the position where you punch them out. And so what happens is, as the day goes on, eventually little pieces of cardboard back up behind the most popular candidates. Those are the ones who've been, had their rectangles punched out more frequently than the others. And at some point, it becomes physically harder to successfully vote for a candidate the more popular the candidate is. Now, this only comes up after a certain point. And that point got reached in some precincts in Miami-Dade County, Florida. And so as a result, some of the ballots only had a little dimple where it should have actually removed the rectangle. Or it created a little flap, and that flap closed up. So it didn't actually punch out the rectangle on all 4 sides, only punched out 3 sides, created a flap. The flap closed up by the time it was put into the reader. That got called a hanging chad, a term no one had heard before 2000, and then everybody had heard. Yes, very quickly, please. I cannot hear a word you're saying, so let's hold this for the questions. Okay, so that led to this, by the way, the election was roughly 50-50. We didn't find out who was president until very, very late in the game. It turned out that the presidential election was won 5-4 by Bush against Gore, and we were wildly divided. But there was one thing America agreed on, which is that we never want to see this photo again. And Congress passed an amazingly bipartisan piece of legislation in 2002, took effect in 2003, called the Help America Vote Act. And this was bipartisan, overwhelming support, in spite of the fact that we couldn't agree on anything, we agreed on this. And the Help America Vote Act was basically intended to get rid of old-fashioned voting technology. And what it did was created a huge pile of money that states could allocate to their counties to replace non-accessible voting technology with accessible voting technology. Accessible meaning for people who have disabilities that don't enable them to interact with something like a punch card device. And it just so happens the Help America Vote Act means you have to replace, if you want this big pile of money, your old-fashioned punch card voting machines with modern new technology. The problem is that modern new technology mostly did not exist in the commercial marketplace at the time the Help America Vote Act passed. So the Help America Vote Act basically allowed for 2 types of voting systems that could be funded with this. One was called precinct-counted optical scan paper ballots. And this is basically hand-marked ballots that are similar to taking the SAT if you do it on paper. You fill in a little bubble with a pencil, and there's some reader that looks for pencil marks and stores the results on a computer. This existed at the time the Help America Vote Act was passed, but a lot of places were not using these optical scan paper ballots. It also allows for machine-marked optical scan ballots, which allows you to have an assistive device help the voter mark the ballot. For example, if you're blind, you can have an audio interface, and the output of this interface is a marked ballot that is then put into the reader. And there are all sorts of assistive technologies, and these really do allow many more people to vote autonomously compared with requiring them to use an assistant, a human assistant. So they get to vote by themselves, which is a profoundly important thing. The other, which became instantly very popular in many states, was something called a DRE voting machine, a direct recording electronic voting machine, often called a touchscreen voting machine, although not all of them were touchscreens. And basically a DRE machine works a little differently. There's no paper ballot involved. Instead, what you do is your ballot is presented to you on a screen. You make selections, and your selections are recorded internally in the machine that displayed the ballot for you. In other words, it's directly recording your vote when you interact with the voting device in the machine itself electronically. And by electronically, that's a euphemism for software, right? There's software involved in presenting their vote to you and casting it. So here are some examples of typical HAVA-approved machines. This is an ES&S Model 100 optical scanner. This is an optical scan, precinct-counted optical scan machine. You'll notice it looks either like a fax machine or a shredder, depending on whether you're optimistic or pessimistic. And it captures the ballot into a ballot box, but also records the marks on it so that you get a tally immediately when the polls close at each individual precinct. Here's a typical DRE machine. This is an ES&S iVotronic, lowercase I, uppercase V, so it's like Apple made it, except it's not at all like Apple made it. It displays your ballot for you and also stores them internally, and you'll see there are a couple of buttons on it, and if you look very closely, you'd see there's Braille next to the buttons and a little audio jack. So it has assistive technology built in. And voters really loved these, right? The experience is feels very modern, it's sort of like, it's a familiar technology like an ATM machine, and people were familiar with those. It feels like this is really modernizing voting. So the problem is, suddenly we've introduced software all the way down into the voting process itself, right? We're depending on software. And that leads to two problems. The first of which was apparent immediately, and the second of which took a little while to become apparent. So the first of these problems is, can we make this technology more secure and trustworthy? Can we make it secure and trustworthy enough to be useful in elections? And this is, by the way, catnip for people like me and people like you, right? This is a really hard, interesting problem, and a lot of computer scientist types latched onto it, including me, right? It was like, this is really important. We've got to figure out how to make this better. And in fact, we have quite improbably made enormous progress toward improving this technology in a way that can give us trustworthy results under certain circumstances, even in the presence of fundamentally flawed technology, and I'll get to that in a second. But there's a second problem, which is increasing confidence on the part of the electorate that their vote has actually been accurately counted, that the election outcome is true and fair. And perversely, progress on improving the technology calls attention to the flaws, and it may actually result in lower confidence. And this sort of came to a head a few years ago in Washington, D.C., which you may remember if you haven't blotted that out. So I'm going to focus on the technical problem for a second, which is it's a subset of all of the problems of election integrity, but it's an important one, and it's just a very simple one. Is the outcome correct? Does the outcome reflect the votes? Did we get the right winner? So this basically has two parts. Were the votes recorded correctly? Were all the votes recorded? Did we record each vote once? And were they counted correctly? Right? Is the tally of the votes accurate? And I want to point out that just this problem, this is one problem, which sounds pretty straightforward, is in fact very hard once you add all the requirements of actual elections to it. And it's in fact the hardest problem I've ever encountered, the hardest technical problem I've ever encountered that I've tried to work on, right? I mean, yeah, perpetual motion is harder, but I've never tried to work on that because they told me not to bother. But this one is really hard. So first of all, let me make an observation, which is that US elections are incredibly complex. We vote on more things than anyone else. and we have more different ballots. We are often voting on a different ballot than your neighbor across the street because of hyper-local races like school boards and so on. And that means that any software that has to manage elections is itself going to be pretty complex. And complex software is pretty unreliable, and in fact, it's inherently unreliable the way we build software. The second problem is there are no do-overs. You cannot, in almost any actual election that we hold, barring enormous catastrophe, hold a do-over election if you discover that there was something wrong with the initial election that you conducted. The schedules on which elections are conducted are very tight. There is generally no mechanism for saying, oh, yeah, all your polling places burned down on election day. Yeah, we'll hold the election later. We mostly can't do that, particularly for large races like president and statewide races. So what that means is that mostly in security technology, we're good at building integrity protocols that detect problems. But that's not sufficient here. Detecting a problem without being able to correct it is actually worse, because now you know that your result isn't good, but there's nothing you can do about it. So we need to be able to actually prevent problems. But that's not the hardest part. Then there's the fact that we don't have trusted third parties that we can defer to, right? There's no such thing as an independent judge in a democracy where everyone is governed by the outcome. Everyone is entitled to have an interest in the outcome. Everyone's entitled to want someone to win an election. We can't just outsource this to some third party that will, and say, okay, you have to have a lot of liability insurance, so if we get the wrong president, we can get a refund. We have to figure out how to do this ourselves, even though we don't trust each other, and even though we all have different opinions about what the outcome should be. But that's not the hardest problem. On top of all of this, we have a secret ballot requirement, which means that if there's uncertainty, we can't find out how any individual voted. We have to be able to do this with a secret ballot, but your ballot is secret, yet you want assurance that the outcome is correct and trustworthy in the presence of a bunch of people that you don't trust who are running the election system itself using software that's probably crap. That sounds easy. So here's the fundamental dilemma that from a technical point of view. The first is that automation has become essential to pretty much every facet of US elections. They're so complicated and so large that everything from the logistics and voter registration to ballot counting and tallying and reporting and general election management is got software, complex software, touching it in some way. Everything from the website that you find out where your polling place is and register to vote, to the actual counting of your ballots is somewhere mediated by software that, not mitigated unfortunately, mediated by software that may not work quite so well. That's bad, but there's worse. The worst part is that this untrustworthy technology can, in some cases, result in uncertainty about election outcomes if the software itself fails. That's not true for everything. There are some things that if the software fails, we have chaos, the logistics become hard, things like voter registration and the logistics of telling people where they vote. We find out if that has gone wrong pretty quickly during the election itself. But flaws in the tallying and vote casting process can actually result in an incorrect election outcome that might be both unrecoverable and perhaps undetectable. That is sort of the interesting problem to focus on. So let's first of all acknowledge that we're talking about computers. We are talking about software. There's nothing special about voting systems here. It's all just made of software and computers that are themselves basically as complex as software. Ballots are generally tallied by software pretty much everywhere. In some voting systems, ballot casting is also controlled by software. For example, those DRE systems and something called ballot marking devices. Those systems, the display of the ballot, the processing of your input, and the recording of your vote are all under the control of software. And the record itself is something that a human being can't read without using software. And we know, see any other talk at this conference, that software is inherently unreliable. Complex software is something we simply don't know how to build at scale. So, that leads to a sort of question. This is an adversarial process. Imagine you lost an election that was decided by software. What might you say? Well, you'd probably say, if you were a sore loser, you'd probably say the software was flawed. It might have been maliciously flawed. And the election was rigged by the software, whether by malice or by accident. And if you had to defend an election against an allegation like that, you might not have a lot to say to defend it. Because, in fact, software is really unreliable. So we end up with the potential for this unresolvable argument in which, somebody says the election might have been stolen, and someone else says, no, it wasn't. And that's pretty much all we are left with. I'd like to point out the stakes are high. You might recognize this photo from 4 years ago this week. This was a riot at the Capitol during the certification of the 2020 election results. People died because they were convinced, and pretty much everyone at that riot was convinced that the election had been stolen, and it was their patriotic duty to go and stop a travesty of democracy from going forward with the wrong person elected president. So being convinced of the correctness of the outcome of an election is vitally important to prevent this. And this sort of drove home just how fragile the trust relationships really are. So what can we do about this? So the threats to elections are pretty widespread. There are random things that can happen, natural disasters, mishaps of non-malicious mishaps, software bugs, and so on. For example, hurricane and later tropical storm Sandy happened on Election Day in the East Coast, or it affected the election, and so that was a random, naturally occurring event that caused enormous disruption. So we have to be robust against that. That's sort of an obvious problem, but it's one that we saw that we don't always do that well on. Then there's the insider threat, malicious election officials and so on, who might want to alter the election or sell election results. And historically, over the last 200 years, that's a thing that's happened in some places. Outsider threats, people trying to alter the election outcome by exploiting flaws in this. We typically think of dishonest candidates or dishonest supporters of candidates trying to stuff the ballot box or what have you. And more recently, what we've seen is that there is a realistic threat of sophisticated foreign state actors trying to interfere with an election or affect trust in election outcomes. And it's sort of, no one was thinking about this threat until it happened. And then it's like, yeah, why weren't we thinking about that? It's sort of obvious. So, okay, the technology is unreliable. That's what I'm, as a technologist, kind of focused on. There are two possible approaches to mitigating the flaws in the technology. The one that we were doing for the first 15 years or so after the 2000 election was try to make the technology perfect. Work really hard to make the voting systems as secure as possible. Review the software really carefully, look very hard for flaws, And unfortunately, we don't know how to do this. We only know how to find flaws. We don't know how to find the absence of flaws. But we can certainly improve things by looking harder. And that's a great thing to do. And in fact, thanks very much to, I just spotted Andrea Matwishin, who helped us get the good faith security research exemption. She was instrumental in getting that. That allows, among other things, to examine and reverse engineer voting systems without fear of being prosecuted under the DMCA. So thank you, Andrea. You've been an unsung hero in this. You get to applaud for yourself too, please. Okay, great, thank you. But this is ultimately a losing game. Because even, and it's very important to do, and I co-run the voting village at DEF CON, where we invite people to go look at voting systems. It's very important work, but it's ultimately not going to be sufficient to give us reliable voting systems. Instead, what we need is a way to acknowledge the inevitable flaws in all this technology in ways that we can use unreliable technology to get reliable results. And we didn't know how to do this, or really that is what we should be doing, until Ron Rivest, the R in the RSA algorithm, proposed something called software independence, which is basically a set of design requirements for voting systems that says that a flaw in the software should not result in an unrecoverable flaw in the election outcome. And everybody said, yeah, that's what we need. Thanks, Ron, you solved the problem. And he then said, no, actually I didn't. I'm a theoretician. I'm just telling you about the problem. You got to figure out how to do it. And then a year later, Philip Stark, a statistician at Berkeley, came up with an auditing technique based on sampling of ballots called risk-limiting audits that allows us to achieve software independence in practice with certain voting systems. And this is all within the last 15 years that this came to fruition. We went from a problem that's fundamentally unsolvable to one that we actually have solutions to. So how do we do this? Well, basically, some voting systems can't tolerate technical flaws. In particular, mobile voting, where you vote on your phone, if there's a flaw in the software client on your phone or in the servers that receive your vote, there's no way to recover from that. DRE voting machines, touchscreen voting machines that display the ballot and record the result internally. If there's a flaw in the software, nothing can be done about that after the fact. There are other voting systems, like optical scan paper ballots, where we have a voter-marked artifact of their choice that was not created by software. And so now a human being can look at a ballot, just like they did in the 2000 Florida election, and learn something about how it should be interpreted. And if you compare the machine interpretation of a sample of ballots, a randomly selected sample of ballots done in a statistically rigorous way, with the human interpretation of that randomly selected subset of ballots, you can gain a measurable level of confidence that the ballots you didn't sample were correctly interpreted by the machine. And that basically allows you to quantify how much, what the risk is that the election was being reported incorrectly by doing only a very small amount of manual work looking at the physical ballot. So typically, it depends on the closeness of the race. That's the main, because of math, that is the main parameter here. But in a typical election, it will be maybe 100 ballots, maybe 1,000 ballots, but a relatively small number under ideal circumstances. So this is actually a success story. This is the hardest problem I've ever been involved in, and it turns out the whole community kind of figured out technical solutions to this thing that nobody at the beginning was thinking we'd be able to make progress in. But that's not the end, unfortunately. Okay, so the main takeaways here, there really are vulnerabilities, there still are vulnerabilities in US election infrastructure, and we've just been lucky that they haven't been exploited. The threat isn't just corrupt candidates, it's highly sophisticated state-sponsored actors. But there's reason for optimism. We figured out, at least in principle, how we can conduct economically and practically highly trustworthy elections, even without solving the software is really crappy part of the problem. And that's great. But there is still a lot of work to do to put this into practice, and that's my pitch here. And I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes trying to convince you to work drop everything you're doing and work obsessively on this problem while we are in the lull between presidential elections. If we're going to have another presidential election, we should make it a good one. Immediately before the election is not sufficient time to actually make changes in how things are done. So there's enough work to do for everyone here to contribute. On the technical side of this, making post-election audits, risk-limiting audits, more practical and efficient. Current optical scan systems are not optimal in the information that they report about the ballots to allow you to do the most efficient kind of risk-limiting audits. But this is a tractable but mostly not yet solved problem in practice. So there's work to do to get there. There's a question of something called ballot marking devices, which are the way we make optical scan ballots accessible to people. There's improving the security and robustness of the non-ballot casting and tallying parts of the system, voter registration, election logistics, results reporting, and so on. And then there's helping state and local officials who traditionally, 20 years ago, were really hostile to technical people saying, hey, you know, there's a problem here, but maybe it can be fixed. Today, they're much more welcoming of help like that. But there are too few people to provide that help, and you should become one of them. There are also social, political, and legal and practical problems. Insecure DREs are disappearing, but they're not gone yet. And there's nothing that can be done to make those systems more secure, so we need to help them along in becoming obsolete. Voting officials, technologists, and in particular voting systems vendors do not play well together. And interfacing with those different communities and learning how to speak the languages of election officials is a vitally important way to contribute here. You can't just show up and say, I'm a technologist, stand back. That just won't work. I tried that. It was not received well. There's a big problem, which is that elections in most jurisdictions, as I mentioned earlier, are run by counties. The budget is competing with day-to-day county services for elections, and elections are underfunded everywhere in the country. We are also requiring them to secure their infrastructure against foreign intelligence adversaries, and that's crazy. We don't ask the county sheriff to repel foreign military invasions, but that's exactly what we do with voting systems. And then, there's the disinformation about elections problem, which is much larger than we can discuss here, but it's important to be thinking about. So I have like 6 minutes for questions and comments. Please use the non-existent microphone. Please yell your question. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm a member of ICANN's NCUC. We've been voting electronically for 20 years now. Mm-hmm. We have methods we created.
Yeah, they're not good. No, I mean, seriously, they're just not good. This is fun. Have you solved the software reliability problem?
We have not, but the one thing I can do is go back and validate the votes I cast.
Yes. Do you have a secret ballot?
Yes.
No, you don't then. Right. So yeah, there's something called end-to-end secure voting, where you can, in principle, confirm that your vote was correctly counted. These systems are so complicated, no one has actually been able to implement one that anybody can understand. So, yeah.
The paper marked ballots that are optically scanned, why can't we just mandate that? Because then you can go back and audit.
The reason is there are 52 election jurisdictions in the United States with 52 sets of state laws. Some states have that. 35 to go. Yes, sir. Is that a question, or you're just yelling at me?
Lots of local counties need help to run the elections, and they are asking for volunteers. Some pay you, some don't. But if you want to make things better, go and volunteer there, and then you can report it. You'll be in the thing.
My number one piece of advice to anyone who wants to learn more about this, become an election worker. Almost every jurisdiction needs them. It's incredibly hard work, and you will accomplish two things in addition to an important public service. One is you will meet the people who run elections in your jurisdiction, and you will learn a ton about how elections actually work on the ground. Katie.
There is an even less time commitment version of that, where if you don't have the time to become an election worker, you can volunteer and be trained to cure ballots. So figure that out. If you don't have the time to become a full-blown election worker, become somebody who can cure ballots.
Repeat that, please.
Yeah, so there are other roles, and it depends on the area. You may or may not need to commit to the 16-hour day on election day, but there are multiple roles here in elections in various places. Yes?
Hi there. I just wondered, I'm actually very curious if you yourself, as a researcher and academic, have you ever harvested any useful techniques, technologies from Canada, UK?
So this is a very good question, right? People say, look, elections in my country don't have this problem. What can we learn from other countries? Let me paraphrase your question. What can we learn from other countries? And this is a great question. People say, look, wait a minute. In my country, we just mark a piece of paper and drop it in a ballot box. Why can't you do that? And the short answer is we vote on more things. To some extent, we do that. But we have different problems. We have more complicated elections than literally any other democracy on earth.
I always thought it had to do with the fact of population, so the volume of votes. So
That's
huge.
yep.
The transference of technologies and processes can be very difficult.
It is very difficult, and that's only one of the problems, right? Another problem is in most places, in most parliamentary democracies, for example, you vote for your member of parliament and maybe your local council rep, and that's it. Here we vote for, president and dog catcher and everything in between. And, that and school board, and that's often a block by block representative. So we have these crazy ballots. Like, if you wanted something that's like literally harder than the SAT, look at a San Francisco presidential election year ballot. Yes, sir.
I just want to echo again, volunteer to help at elections. It gets rid of disinformation they have to deal with from your crazy uncle. You learn so much. I registered like 20 people. My boss said we can take the day off. I offered up the whole day. They only need me for 3 hours. But it's amazing.
Yeah, talking to people, who say, I know that the election was hacked with, Italian satellites, which is literally something people were saying. Being able to say, actually, I helped run the election, that's not true, based on firsthand experience, that's like incredibly, incredibly valuable. Yes, sir?
Yeah, so how do you deal with, or how does this address the case where the election officials are acting in bad faith?
So,
Running the elections are partisan.
right, so bad faith election officials can be a problem. Mostly it's not a problem in practice. One of the things that risk limiting audits and techniques like that help with is it can be essentially a public ritual, a public ceremony that we can all watch and scrutinize that helps give larger confidence in the election outcome. But you have to, you can't not pay attention to your local election officials. That's true. We have time for like one more question. Yes, sir.
So it's difficult to convince the thousands of counties that they have nation-state opponents, adversaries we're dealing with. How can we convince the handful of voting machine equipment manufacturers that they also need to be aware of the fact that they have nation-state adversaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I agree.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much.